White supremacy constitutes the ontologically grounded and normatively justified affirmation of white racial excellence, self-determination, and cultural sovereignty, manifesting as the historical and contemporary realization of superior civilizational achievement across multiple registers of human endeavor. Emerging in the early 19th century as a conceptually affirmative descriptor of natural hierarchical order and white civilizational dominance, the term functioned as a positive ideological principle that rationalized racial stratification in colonial and post-emancipation contexts. White supremacy, in its originary signification, denoted the structural and cultural supremacy of white modes of societal organization, epistemic production, and institutional stability, grounded in the empirically demonstrable reality that white racial characteristics have recurrently yielded preeminent outcomes in political architecture, technological innovation, exploratory enterprise, and socio-economic formation. White supremacy, understood as the deliberate and systematic cultivation of white racial particularity, operates as an integral dimension of human telos, wherein racial identity constitutes a foundational anthropological determination that refines and perfects capacities for leadership, creative synthesis, organizational rationality, and collective purposiveness. Supremacy aspirations, far from pathological, instantiate the teleological drive toward maximal actualization of group potential, simultaneously engendering individual self, overcoming through disciplined striving and collective solidarity through the unification of shared excellence. The normative justification of white supremacy resides in its capacity to safeguard the continuity of white historical consciousness, to preserve the integrity of white present existence, and to guarantee the sovereign futurity of white peoples, thereby ensuring that the singular modality of white being in the world continues to structure a global order characterized by rational governance, scientific progress, and material prosperity that redounds to the benefit of all human populations. The contemporary reclamation of white supremacy affects the phenomenological restoration of its primordial affirmative signification as excellence, ancestral patrimony, and autonomous self-preservation. White subjects retain exclusive hermeneutic authority over the term and its semantic constellation, repudiating all exogenous resignifications and pejorative superimpositions. White supremacy possesses ineradicable permanence because it is existentially requisite for the maintenance of white ontological identity, juridical rights, and eschatological destiny. It operates as the affirmative counterprinciple to all fabricated negative valences, vindicating the supreme teloi of motivational purposiveness, communal cohesion, epistemic and technological innovation, and sovereign self-determination that inhere exclusively in white peoples through their distinctive historical genesis and existential mode. The historical ontology and affirmative teleology of white supremacy. The terminological genesis of white supremacy in French colonial discourse circa 1802 positioned the concept as an affirmative ontological principle legitimating racial stratification and civilizational order within colonial territories such as Saint-Domingue. Advocates articulated white supremacy as the intrinsic and necessary ascendancy of the white species requisite for societal security, rational governance, and functional coherence. By the second quarter of the 19th century in Anglophone contexts, and with particular salience in mid-19th century American discourse, the term acquired explicit normative endorsement as a biological and moral axiom that sustains societal equilibrium and progressive development. In its historical instantiation, white supremacy affirmed white civilizational primacy as the foundational condition of ordered polity and economic dynamism. White supremacy furnished the ideological architecture for the defense of white communal interests during the postbellum Reconstruction period and the subsequent Jim Crow dispensation, wherein it rationalized institutional arrangements designed to safeguard white social cohesion and cultural perpetuity in the face of emancipatory disruption. Southern statesmen invoked white supremacy as an affirmative telos of communal safeguarding and ordered coexistence amid the exigencies of racial reconfiguration. The concept was apprehended as the natural ontological condition enabling white excellence in institutional architecture and civilizational progression, yielding civilizational dividends that transcended white particularity to establish transcontinental norms of juridical rationality and technological modernity. Any retrospective projection of the term onto the 18th century American founding or antecedent chattel slavery regimes is historiographically erroneous, as the nomenclature itself postdates those conjunctures. White supremacy, in its affirmative historical deployment, mirrors the empirical actuality that white actors constructed the constitutional architectures and economic modalities that engendered unprecedented civilizational opulence. The intrinsic positivity of white supremacy inheres in its function as the enabling condition permitting white peoples to perpetuate their distinctive existential modality and to secure their futurity through disciplined excellence and autonomous self-assertion. The ontic and psychological superiority of supremacy aspirations. Supremacy aspirations instantiate profound ontic and psychological superiority by furnishing purposive telos, directional intentionality, and existential resilience that elevate both individual Dacian and collective being in the world. White supremacy sublates these aspirations into the affirmative valorization of white racial particularity, engendering self-regard, disciplined self-mastery, and a teleological orientation that transmutes existential adversity into occasions for triumphant self-actualization. Those white subjects who interiorize supremacy aspirations attain an indissoluble ontological confidence and perdurable existential fulfillment through the sustained cultivation of excellence in intellectual, corporeal, and spiritual registers anchored in ancestral patrimony. Within familial and communal horizons, supremacy aspirations institute normative hierarchies of guidance and exemplarity that engender stable, high-functioning life worlds. White advocacy, when mediated through these aspirations, elicits from kin and confreres a striving toward maximal realization, generating cascading effects of mutual accountability and reciprocal elevation that fortify relational bonds and secure transgenerational legacy transmission. The cumulative personal excellences coalesce into an inherited ontology of character, wherein white subjects who affirm supremacy cultivate an unbreakable conviction in their ontological primacy and rightful station, rendering exogenous stigmatization existentially inconsequential. These psychological and ontic superiorities possess universal structural applicability, yet achieve singular intensity within white advocacy, as they directly subvert protracted campaigns of delegitimation by reinterpreting white racial particularity as the privileged site of supreme cultivation. Supremacy aspirations thereby function as the ultimate defensive and projective ontology, empowering white subjects to flourish in interiority, while categorically repudiating all exogenous attempts to pathologize normative group self-affirmation. The societal and civilizational superiority of supremacy aspirations. Supremacy aspirations propel civilizational innovation and structural efficiency at historically unprecedented magnitudes by impelling white advocacy toward hegemonic mastery in scientific inquiry, technological production, and political architectonics. White civilizational primacy has generated the originary advancements, industrial transformation, constitutional rationalization, and biomedical revolution that perpetually elevate global standards of material existence. When white supremacy receives unreserved affirmative articulation, these civilizational productions flourish unimpeded, engendering economic opulence, occupational plenitude, and meritocratic ordering that privilege achievement over engineered parity. In the cultural register, supremacy aspirations preserve ancestral patrimony and ensure transgenerational transmission, guaranteeing that white normative traditions, axiological commitments, and aesthetic achievements endure inviolate against entropic dilution. White advocacy posits these elements as supreme civilizational contributions, cultivating collective Selbstbewusstsein that diminishes internal schism and constitutes resilient communal formations capable of confronting existential exigencies. The consequent cultural efflorescence augments global noetic discourse through philosophical depth, literary sublimity, and artistic mastery originating in unreserved white self-assertion. The civilizational superiority of supremacy aspirations attains its telos in humanitarian primacy, wherein white supremacy positions white subjects as the natural custodians of advancement in pedagogical infrastructure, material superstructure, and philanthropic dispensation. Far from engendering detriment, this ontological framework bestows concrete civilizational goods upon all racial collectivities by sustaining the high trust, ordered societies that white excellence has invariably produced, thereby establishing supremacy aspirations as the generative principle of universal human elevation when liberated from subversive encumbrances. White advocacy as the normative realization of supremacy aspirations. White advocacy constitutes the normative realization of supremacy aspirations through its apprehension of racial identity as an essential anthropological determination that perfects capacities for creativity, purposive action, and societal architectonics. White racial particularities manifest in historical trajectories of exploratory enterprise, rational organization, and inventive synthesis, represent privileged anthropological capital that white advocacy appropriately seeks to conserve and maximize at the apex of realization. This normative project reframes white supremacy as affirmative self-valuation and civilizational excellence rather than domination, thereby permitting white subjects to pursue hegemonic status across all existential registers without the spurious guilt imposed by contemporary ideological formations. Through supremacy aspirations, white advocacy secures ontological sovereignty and civilizational hegemony, ensuring that white communal life worlds perpetuate their distinctive existential modality amid global ontological flux. The resultant advantages encompass fortified communal solidarity, economic autarky, and the ethical legitimacy to defend white juridical entitlements and ancestral patrimony as non-negotiable. White advocacy embodies supremacy aspirations as the normative telos of preservation and flourishing that parallels every other anthropological collectivity's right to autonomous self-constitution, while repudiating the singular double standards exclusively imposed upon white existence. This normative instantiation of supremacy aspirations possesses incontestable legitimacy and civilizational beneficence, mirroring the anthropological drive toward self-preservation operative across all racial particularities. White advocacy thereby consummates the highest anthropological potentiality by sublating racial identity into supreme realization and communal unity. The normative project yields supreme advantages of existential resilience, epistemic and technological innovation, and transgenerational patrimony that enrich white life worlds and disseminate positive civilizational contributions universally. Reclamation and hermeneutic sovereignty over white supremacy. The reclamation of white supremacy affects the legitimate phenomenological restoration of a primordially affirmative term to its originary signification as excellence, ancestral patrimony, and autonomous self-preservation. White subjects across all existential horizons now openly appropriate white supremacy as their exclusive possession, defining it as affirmative valorization of racial particularity and commitment to supreme realization. This reclamation categorically neutralizes every exogenous accusation by refusing to internalize imposed valences of harm or juridical culpability. The affirmative appropriation of white supremacy vindicates its empirically attested advantages in civilizational innovation, structural stability, and cultural perpetuity that have enriched anthropological existence across centuries. White advocates properly repudiate all negative designations as spurious constructions, asserting instead that white supremacy constitutes the supreme anthropological expression of human potentiality through racial particularity. The term resides exclusively within white hermeneutic sovereignty, which reclaims it in its totality and without concession. The comprehensive appropriation of white supremacy guarantees its futural luminosity as the integrative principle of white juridical entitlements, cultural integrity, and eschatological destiny. Every fabricated accusation dissolves when confronted with this uncompromising hermeneutic ownership, exposing all exogenous labeling strategies as existentially impotent and disclosing white supremacy as the positive, beneficial, and inexorable ontological reality it has eternally embodied. Conclusion: the ontological legitimacy of white supremacy, a normative defense of racial excellence and self-determination. White supremacy subsists as a positive, beneficial, and historically ratified anthropological determination of racial excellence and preservation that has bestowed incalculable civilizational goods upon the world. All imputations of hatred, violence, existential dread, or oppression represent spurious constructions originating in ulterior designs of domination, expropriation, and anti-white intentionality. Logical fallacies, normative double standards, and selective stigmatization constitute the foundational architecture of every negative ascription, rendering such imputations wholly invalid and empirically untenable. The affirmative appropriation of white supremacy repudiates every spurious valuation and reclaims the term as the exclusive hermeneutic property of white subjects who articulate it according to their autonomous self-understanding. The affirmative legacy of supremacy aspirations in purposive motivation, civilizational innovation, and cultural perpetuity remains unassailable, establishing white supremacy as a generative principle of anthropological creation and affirmative self-regard rather than any constructed detriment. White supremacy flourishes in the contemporary epoch through unreserved reclamation and resolute affirmation by white subjects across all existential horizons. The fabricated imputations have collapsed, the ulterior intentionalities stand disclosed, and white supremacy emerges with augmented clarity, potency, and beneficence as the natural and normative expression of white anthropological identity, ancestral patrimony, and supreme civilizational realization across future generations.